I'm going to move straight on now to our next speaker, Chris Williamson. Our audience in Britain will not need any introduction for Chris, but for the benefit of those coming from further afield, Chris was formerly a Member of Parliament in Britain for the Labour Party. He was one of the closest allies of Jeremy Corbyn during the period of his leadership, and in fact was booted out of the Labour Party for being rather too loyal to Jeremy Corbyn and to the cause of peace and justice, and in particular for his refusal to give up on support for the Palestinian people, which of course had him branded as an anti-Semite, and that was the basis on which they kicked him out, just as it was the basis on which the media hounded Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years. Chris Williamson, since that time, has founded a movement in this country called the Resistance Movement, and he comes now to us from Derby in the north of England, northish.
Well, northish, yeah. Thanks very much indeed, Jyoti, for that introduction. It's the Midlands, really, the East Midlands where we are, but the kind of gateway to the north is how we like to describe ourselves, really. I just want to pay tribute to the incredible contributions that we've heard this evening from the previous speakers. And I myself am no expert, but I'm very concerned, obviously, about what's been happening in Yemen. And we know that it is the world's worst humanitarian crisis that's taking place right now. And just looking at some of the statistics before I joined the meeting this evening, it's an incredible fact that 80% of the Yemeni population, as a result of this war, are now forced to survive on foreign aid. And that is just completely unacceptable and something that we should all be rightly ashamed of, given Britain's involvement in this terrible war. The scale of suffering is unimaginable, and we've heard a flavour of some of that this evening, and those of us that have looked into it in a little bit more depth. I mean, it's truly horrendous, and it's absolutely right to describe it as the world's worst humanitarian, well, it's a catastrophe rather than a crisis, and it's a war that's been going on now for almost as long as World War II, and there doesn't appear to be any obvious end in sight, but obviously we need to work hard to try and bring that about. And when you look at, I mean, you know, obviously I don't like you kind of use statistics all the time, but I was looking at the Yemen data project, or some of the stats that they put out now. Since the start of the war, there's been 22,485 air raids, and at least 30% of those air raids have been against non-military targets. 2,175 residential areas, according to the Yemen data project, have been targeted. 244 schools have been targeted with these air raids. 33 hospitals, 65 food storage facilities. And I think it was George that mentioned the war crimes. These are absolutely war crimes. There is no doubt about it. I mean, and the people responsible should be in the International Criminal Court. And as Ruben has said, you know, Britain is implicated in this. And that should shame us all, as I've said, Jyoti. It really should, because the bombs and the planes are built in the United Kingdom. And it's very, very profitable. Very, very profitable. I mean, you know, ranging from the bomb or missiles, ranging from about 22,000 right up to the cruise missiles at around £750,000 per pop, as it were. And so, understandably, the people involved in those industries, you know, are cashing in. And they are very influential, regrettably, on the political scene. And I think it was you, Jyoti, that called into question the suitability of our democracy. You're absolutely right. It's a passion of mine. I think the representative democracy is totally failing us, because the representatives that we have in the Houses of Parliament are not representing the people that elect them, in my opinion. They are representing the lobbyists. They're representing the military-industrial complex. How can it be that we are saying that jobs are reliant upon the kind of arms industry? I mean, Britain is, I think, the second biggest arms exporter in the world. And I think Saudi Arabia is the biggest client of those arms exports. It is an absolute disgrace. And it's something that it's really important, I think, that we bring this to the attention of the people, because there are alternatives to building weapons of war. And we know that from the work that was done by the Lucas Shop Stewards Combine as long ago as 1976, when they said we can put our high-tech skills, instead of building weapons of war, armaments and so on, we can use them for socially useful products. And I think they came up with around 150, but sadly none of them were ever put into production in this country. But I think the vast majority of them were put into production elsewhere. I mean, they were coming forward back in 1976, for example, with things like solar power, combined heat and power, and these sorts of things. You know, wind turbines was another area that they were suggesting that could be used. Hybrid vehicles and so on. They were well ahead of their time, and these were workers on the shop floor who were coming forward with it. So there is an alternative. And the argument about, you know, jobs being reliant upon the arms industry, even though it's an immoral argument, it doesn't really play, because there are alternatives. And in any event, the defence industry in this country is in terminal decline in terms of the number of jobs, because since 1981, where there was around 430,000 people employed in arms manufacture, it's now around 130,000. So 2/3 of the jobs have gone anyway. So it's so important, I think, therefore, that we're arguing for defence diversification. But going back to Yemen, I mean, the fact is, and again, just to kind of repeat the point that Ruben made about Britain being implicated in this, I mean, there are around 6,000, over 6,000, in fact, British contractors stationed in Saudi who are providing training for pilots and carrying out the maintenance on the aircraft. There are RAF personnel in the Saudi Command and Control Centre, where the targeting, where the selection of targets in Yemen actually takes place. So I think that, you know, it is possible to end this war. And I know, I think George said that, you know, the war will go on, and, you know, Biden coming is not going to make a great deal of difference. And I don't particularly disagree with that. I mean, I'm reminded really of the Gramsci quote about pessimism of intellect and optimism of the will. Well, you know, I'm optimistic of the will. Let's be optimistic in terms of what we can force our political representatives to do, because we know, and if we can get this information out there to the public, I think they would be horrified about the fact that this war is only being able to be prosecuted thanks to the efforts of British military personnel and British contractors. And we should therefore be putting pressure on our so-called representatives to actually, you know, bring this war to an end. And I think if we can, through our will, through our collective power that we have, I think we can bring sufficient pressure to actually bring about the change. And you know, I think it was Ruben mentioned Lance Corporal Ahmed al-Batati, who bravely drew attention to the war in Yemen. I mean, this was a serving soldier who produced a video about the war in Yemen, said he wasn't prepared to continue to serve in the British Army whilst this arms trade was going on. And he then conducted a vigil outside the Ministry of Defence, said he would blow a whistle every 10 minutes to represent a child which is killed on average every 10 minutes in Yemen. And, you know, he was arrested, obviously, and I was involved in mounting or supporting a campaign on behalf of Ahmed. And thankfully, you know, he wasn't prosecuted. There was a fear that he would be subject to a court-martial, but he's been thrown out of the army. But thankfully, I think, thanks to the pressure that we put on, and this is where I think, you know, the pressure can work, you know, the optimism of will. We were able to, I think, you know, prevent Ahmed from being subject to a court-martial. And we really do need to celebrate people like that, because it was an incredibly brave thing to do, because the pressure, the peer pressure, you know, the pressure from the, you know, the commanding officers and so on is so intense in the army, as we know. And to see you know, a gesture like that, it is incredible, and it's something that I think we should absolutely celebrate. But I want to just also, before I finish, Joe, to just touch on and pick up on a point that Tim mentioned about the role of the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates. And it's important to think that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a coalition prosecuting this war. It's not just Saudi, and, you know, the United Arab Emirates are heavily involved. I think they've withdrawn their own military service personnel, but they are still absolutely involved in the conflict there through sponsoring brutal militias, absolutely brutal militias, and mercenary death squads. And I was looking up something again just before we came on air, Joe Tia. The Rights Radar Foundation and the International Institute for Rights and Development told the Human Rights Council in Geneva that the UAE have hired American mercenaries to carry out high-profile assassinations in Yemen. And this is something else that we absolutely, I think, need to give the opportunity to publicity, because I think people will be absolutely horrified on both sides of the Atlantic that this sort of thing is going on. So behind the glossy propaganda relating to the United Arab Emirates, you know, the Emirates Airlines, their involvement in British horse racing, the Premier League and all that kind of thing, the UAE is heavily involved in this conflict. They are an anti-democratic, brutal regime, which is not just in terms of influencing the situation in Yemen, but has a pernicious influence on the whole region. And they really fear, I think, you know, Arab democracy, and doing their level best to put an end to it. And this is why it was such a chilling move when we saw the links, which again Tim touched on, that they're now normalizing so-called relations with Israel. That is a very worrying development, and something that, you know, we need to do everything we can to rail against and highlight, you know, the reasoning behind it and what the implications of that actually are. And so I think meetings like this are so important, really, in bringing you know, the oxygen of publicity to the reality of the situation in Yemen, and all the other aspects of it, which, as I say, Tim touched on. That was just one aspect of it in relation to those links between Israel and the UAE and what that might mean. And so I think, just in conclusion then, Jyoti, what I would say is that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, are behaving like rogue states, and we should therefore treat them as such. And that's the way to go, I think, and demand that our representatives, you know, stop the kind of normalized relations with these rogue states, and start bringing pressure on them to change their appalling and despicable ways, which is wreaking such appalling suffering on the Yemeni people.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that powerful contribution. And you remind us, of course, of the criminal destruction of all the infrastructure that's necessary for life, that's going on underneath Saudi's American and US bombs. The destruction of food and water supplies, of roads, of railways, of schools, of hospitals, everything that you need to live is being destroyed in an attempt to starve the people there into submission. And that makes their resistance, I think, all the more impressive and powerful, and something that should be much more celebrated and known about than it is. Chris rightly points out that this is a criminal, unjust, aggressive war, and we must also always remember, you know, when we're talking about, our rulers love to tell us that they got the United Nations to agree to their latest invasion. You know, unjust, aggressive war, the invasion of another country, was classified by the Nuremberg tribunals after World War II as the highest of crimes, as a crime against humanity, the crime of all crimes, to wage an unjust war. And the role of the media was also held up in Nuremberg as a crime against humanity, to facilitate such a war with propaganda which either prettifies it, normalizes it, excuses it, or suppresses information about it. All of that is absolutely criminal in terms of international law, as if our rulers have any interest actually in the realities of international law, but they like to pretend that they do. And that's something that we should therefore understand, that as far as there is such a thing as international law, these wars and the support of them by the media are absolutely against those laws and against all principles of humanity.